This is not just another crime story. This is about how the deadliest trafficking operation on the East Coast learned the hard way that some old Marines never lose their edge. When they brought their victims to the wrong neighborhood, they didn't realize they were walking into a trap set by a master of unconventional warfare. What follows is the story of how one man would dismantle an entire criminal network in just 3 days, using nothing but a repair shop, decades of combat experience, and the tactical genius that made him a legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Detroit's Corktown district as Frank Torres unlocked the heavy metal door of his auto repair shop. At 67, his weathered hands still moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime working with precision machinery, though the machines he'd once serviced in his previous life were far deadlier than the Ford pickup currently waiting on his lift. The familiar scent of motor oil and WD-40 filled the morning air as he began his daily routine, each movement deliberate and purposeful, despite the arthritis that served as a constant reminder of decades spent in less comfortable positions. Torres Auto Repair occupied the corner building where Corktown met the industrial district, a neighborhood that had weathered Detroit's decline but maintained its blue-collar dignity. Frank had chosen this location carefully 15 years ago when he'd retired from a career that officially didn't exist. Close enough to downtown Detroit to maintain steady business, but far enough from the main commercial strips to avoid the kind of attention that came with high-profile locations. He preferred the anonymity now, the simple satisfaction of diagnosing engine problems and helping working families keep their vehicles running. Maria Gonzalez emerged from the apartment building across the street, her teacher's bag slung over one shoulder as she hurried toward her 10-year-old Honda Civic. Frank had rebuilt the transmission 3 months earlier, charging her barely enough to cover parts because teachers already sacrificed enough for their communities. "Good morning, Frank," Maria called out, waving as she fumbled with her car keys. "Hope you don't mind me starting her up this early." Frank looked up from the engine he was examining and smiled. "Battery terminal still clean?" he asked, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Perfect, thanks to you," Maria replied with genuine gratitude. "You're a lifesaver, Frank. Don't know what I'd do without this place." Frank watched her drive away, the small smile that crossed his weathered face carrying more satisfaction than most people found in their greatest achievements. He'd been called many things during his 25 years of classified service, most of them by enemy combatants who hadn't lived long enough to repeat the experience. But lifesaver was the designation that meant the most to him now. After decades of taking lives in the world's darkest corners, saving them had become his path to redemption. The peaceful morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of a black Escalade with heavily tinted windows. Frank's trained eye immediately catalogued details that civilian observers would miss, the way the vehicle slowed deliberately as it passed his shop, how the passenger was clearly scanning the street for security cameras and potential witnesses, the temporary license plate that suggested either rental or stolen status. Muscle memory from his Force Recon days activated automatically, assess the threat, analyze the tactical situation, prepare contingency responses. The Escalade disappeared around the corner toward the residential section, but Frank's instincts told him it would return. He'd observed this pattern in places like Mogadishu, Fallujah, and a dozen other combat zones whose names would never appear in his official record. Reconnaissance runs, pattern establishment, target identification, and escape route planning. The unsettling difference was that this time, the hunting ground was his neighborhood. 2 hours later, while Frank was diagnosing a misfiring cylinder in Mrs. Patterson's Buick, the Escalade returned with reinforcements. A second vehicle, a dark Ford Explorer, parked across the street, while the Escalade positioned itself near the corner. Through his garage bay window, Frank observed 4 men emerging from the vehicles, all young, all carrying themselves with the predatory confidence of apex predators who had never encountered serious resistance. The way they moved, the way they scanned their surroundings, told Frank everything he needed to know about their tactical training. Minimal. But their intentions were unmistakably sinister. The group approached Chen's bakery, where Mrs. Chen was arranging fresh pastries in her display window. The elderly Chinese woman had survived the Cultural Revolution, immigration to America, and 4 decades of running a small business in a tough neighborhood. She possessed the survival instincts that came from experiencing real hardship. "We're looking for young girls," the apparent leader announced loudly enough for his voice to carry across the street to Frank's garage. "Pretty ones between 14 and 18. We know there's families around here with daughters. We pay very well for the right kind of cooperation." Mrs. Chen's English suddenly became significantly worse than her actual fluency level. "No, understand," she replied with practiced confusion. "You want bread? Fresh bread, very good." The second man stepped closer to her window, his laugh containing no trace of humor. "Come on, Grandma, don't play games with us. We know you see everything that happens in this neighborhood. Young girls walking to school, coming home from school. We're willing to pay good money for information. Real good money." Frank's hands stilled on the wrench he was holding. In his mind, he was instantly transported 25 years back, crouched in a bombed-out building in the Balkans, listening to similar conversations in different languages, but with identical evil intent. Human trafficking, the most despicable form of warfare, waged against the innocent. "We're new to this area," the leader continued, his voice taking on a more threatening edge. "But we're going to be very successful here. We like to work with local businesses, establish mutually beneficial relationships. People who help us do very well. People who cause problems, well, they tend to have accidents." Mrs. Chen clutched her apron, genuine fear evident in her eyes despite her attempt to maintain confused innocence. "No young girls here," she insisted in broken English. "Very old neighborhood. All old people. You go somewhere else now." The third man, who had been silent until now, stepped even closer to the bakery window. "See? That's not the kind of friendly cooperation we're looking for," he said with mock sadness. "We're going to be conducting business in this neighborhood for a long time. It would be very unfortunate if local business owners started experiencing problems. Equipment breaking down, windows getting smashed, delivery trucks having accidents. Bad things happen to people who aren't neighborly." That was enough. Frank set down his tools and walked deliberately toward the bakery, his movement appearing casual to untrained observers, but carrying the controlled lethality of a predator who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, an aging mechanic taking a coffee break. "Afternoon, Mrs. Chen," Frank said pleasantly as he entered the bakery, his tone conversational and friendly. "Thought I'd grab some of those almond cookies you make. Haven't had lunch yet." The 4 traffickers turned to assess this new arrival, seeing precisely what Frank intended them to see. An overweight, graying mechanic in oil-stained coveralls who posed no conceivable threat to their operation. Their dismissive glances told him everything he needed to know about their situational awareness and threat assessment capabilities. Virtually non-existent. "Shop's closed, old man," the leader said without really looking at Frank, his attention still focused on intimidating Mrs. Chen. "Come back in an hour." Frank maintained his mild expression as he replied that he was pretty sure Mrs. Chen owned this bakery, son, and she probably didn't need permission from visitors to serve her regular customers. The leader finally looked directly at Frank, really studied him, and something in those calm, steady eyes made him slightly uncomfortable. "You got some kind of problem with us conducting legitimate business?" he demanded. Frank kept his tone perfectly conversational as he explained that it depends entirely on what kind of business we're talking about. If you gentlemen are interested in purchasing baked goods, no problem whatsoever. If you're here for something else entirely, well, that might be a different situation. The second man laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it now. "Look at this guy, thinking he's some kind of neighborhood tough guy," he said to his companions. "Pops, you have absolutely no idea who you're messing with here." Frank's expression remained completely unchanged as he replied that actually he had a fairly good idea. "The question is whether you gentlemen do." There was something in Frank's voice now, a quality that Mrs. Chen recognized from old war movies, but that the traffickers were too arrogant and inexperienced to interpret correctly. It was the sound of controlled violence, of a man who had walked through literal hell and emerged on the other side with his humanity intact, but his capacity for necessary brutality significantly enhanced. "Look, old man," the leader said, his hand moving casually but deliberately toward his jacket. "We're part of something much bigger than your little neighborhood concerns. Smart people stay out of our way and mind their own business. Really smart people sometimes even profit from being helpful and cooperative." Frank asked with genuine curiosity, "And what about people who aren't smart?" The leader's smile was cold and predatory. "People who aren't smart tend to disappear permanently." Frank nodded thoughtfully and said that was very interesting. In his considerable experience, the people who actually disappeared were usually the ones who thought they were untouchable, who made the mistake of confusing other people's kindness and civility for weakness and vulnerability. The tension in the small bakery was becoming palpable. Mrs. Chen had retreated behind her counter, but she wasn't running for the back door. Something about Frank's presence had fundamentally altered the dynamic of the entire confrontation. "You threatening us, old man?" the second trafficker demanded, stepping closer to Frank in what he probably thought was an intimidating manner. "Not at all," Frank replied calmly, "just making an observation based on extensive personal experience. You see, I've traveled quite extensively in my previous career, encountered many different types of operations in many different parts of the world. And one thing I learned is that the truly professional operators always do their homework thoroughly. They study the territory before they attempt to establish operations. They learn who belongs and who doesn't, who can be approached and who should be avoided entirely." "What's your point, Grandpa?" the third man asked impatiently. Frank's smile was mild, almost grandfatherly, as he explained that his point was these young men obviously hadn't done their research very thoroughly. If they had, they might have discovered that this particular neighborhood possesses certain characteristics that make it fundamentally unsuitable for their specific type of business enterprise. The leader's hand was now resting fully on whatever weapon he carried concealed, though he hadn't drawn it yet. "And what characteristics would those be exactly?" he demanded. Frank replied with simple directness, "It's protected." "Protected by who?" the leader pressed aggressively. "You?" Frank shrugged with apparent casualness as he answered, "Among others." Something in Frank's tone finally penetrated the trafficker's arrogance, making the second man visibly nervous. "Come on, Tony," he said to the leader. "We got the information we came for. Let's check out the other areas we identified." But Tony was committed now, his pride and authority engaged in a way that made retreat impossible. "No," he said firmly, "I want to hear exactly what this old mechanic thinks he's going to do if we decide to establish our operation in his precious little neighborhood." Frank looked directly at Tony for the first time, and the younger man saw something in those eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable look of someone who had killed professionally and efficiently, who had witnessed death in its most brutal and immediate forms and had not merely survived the experience but mastered it completely. "Son," Frank said quietly, "I believe you're asking the wrong question entirely." Tony's voice was less steady than before as he demanded, "What's the right question, then?" Frank's expression remained perfectly calm as he replied that the right question would be, "What are the mathematical chances that you and your associates walk out of this neighborhood alive if you persist in your current course of action?" Tony's hand tightened on his concealed weapon as he declared, "That sounds like a federal crime to me, old man. Threatening people in our line of work brings very serious consequences from very serious people." Frank's expression showed mild interest as he pointed out that federal crime was an interesting phrase to use, considering that trafficking in human beings was also a federal crime, as were kidnapping, conspiracy to commit both, and criminal intimidation of witnesses. Now all four men were staring at Frank with the uncomfortable realization that this conversation had taken a direction they hadn't anticipated or prepared for. "How exactly do you know what our business involves?" the second man asked with growing unease. Frank replied with simple honesty that he'd been hunting people exactly like them for most of his adult life. Different uniform? Different countries? Same fundamental evil, he continued. "And let me share something important about hunters. We always recognize our prey, regardless of how they try to disguise themselves." Tony finally attempted to draw his weapon, but his movement was 3 seconds too slow and tactically flawed in execution. Frank's response was economical, professional, and absolutely devastating in its efficiency. 25 years might have passed since his last official combat mission, but muscle memory and training that deep and extensive never completely fade. The gun was out of Tony's hand and across the bakery floor before he fully comprehended what had happened. Frank had positioned himself behind all four men with such speed and precision that none of them could process the tactical shift. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed considerable violence during the Cultural Revolution, calmly reached under her counter and produced a cellular phone. "Mrs. Chen," Frank said conversationally, while maintaining perfect control of all four would-be traffickers, "would you mind calling Detective Rodriguez at the 14th Precinct? Please tell her that Frank Torres has a priority delivery that requires her immediate personal attention." "Frank Torres?" Tony gasped, his face going pale as he suddenly recognized the name from intelligence briefings within his criminal organization. "The Frank Torres?" Frank's grip tightened slightly as he asked whether Tony was thinking of the individual who spent 25 years with Marine Force Reconnaissance, specializing in hostage rescue operations and unconventional warfare in classified locations. "If so," he confirmed, "then yes, that would indeed be me." The color drained completely from all four faces as the full implications of their situation became clear. They had just attempted to establish a human trafficking operation in the neighborhood that was under the protection of one of the Marine Corps' most decorated and lethal specialists in exactly the type of warfare required to dismantle criminal networks. "The question now," Frank continued in the same conversational tone, "is whether you gentlemen are intelligent enough to provide comprehensive information about your organization in exchange for protective custody, or foolish enough to believe that your employers will somehow protect you once they discover you've been completely compromised." Mrs. Chen finished her phone call and looked at Frank with newfound respect and understanding. "Detective Rodriguez says 5 minutes, she reported. "Perfect," Frank replied. "That provides these gentlemen with adequate time to consider their options very carefully." Tony was beginning to hyperventilate as he protested that Frank didn't understand the situation. "These people don't forgive mistakes or failures," he said desperately. "If they believe we've been compromised or captured, then you'd better hope you can provide law enforcement with sufficient information to neutralize them before they neutralize you." Frank replied matter-of-factly. Because at this moment, your life expectancy is measured in hours regardless of whether you choose to cooperate or not. The sound of approaching sirens filled the morning air as Detective Rodriguez arrived with backup units. Frank released his prisoners and stepped back, his movements casual and unhurried, as if he'd just completed a routine automotive repair. "Frank Torres?" Detective Rodriguez said as she entered the bakery, shaking her head with a mixture of amazement and resignation. "I should have known. Every time we develop a breakthrough in one of these trafficking investigations, somehow your neighborhood remains mysteriously untouched." Frank shrugged modestly as he replied that good neighbors simply look out for each other, Detective. As the 4 traffickers were processed and loaded into patrol cars, Tony looked back at Frank with a mixture of terror and grudging respect. "This operation is much bigger than you realize," he said. "You have absolutely no idea what you've just started." Frank's smile carried the coldness of a Montana winter as he told Tony to give his warmest regards to his supervisors. "Tell them Frank Torres sends his professional compliments and looks forward very much to making their acquaintance in the near future." As the police vehicles disappeared around the corner, Mrs. Chen approached Frank with a plate of fresh almond cookies. "No charge ever again," she said quietly. "Never charge for you, Mr. Frank." Frank accepted the cookies with genuine gratitude, insisting that he was simply being a good neighbor. Mrs. Chen, nothing more. "Good neighbor?" She laughed, the sound filled with relief and admiration. "Good neighbor don't neutralize 4 armed criminals with bare hands like some kind of movie action hero. Good neighbor don't make federal cases appear like magic tricks." Frank was already walking back toward his garage, where Mrs. Patterson's Buick waited for his continued attention. "Just fixing things that are broken, Mrs. Chen," he replied with characteristic understatement. "Same as always, nothing more complicated than that." But as he returned to his workbench, Frank's mind was already operating in full tactical mode. The traffickers' reconnaissance indicated a much larger operation was in active development. Their confidence level suggested significant financial resources and political protection. Most importantly, their willingness to operate in broad daylight indicated they believed themselves to be completely untouchable. They were about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption was. Frank retrieved his secure communication device, a piece of technology that officially didn't exist, and connected him to individuals who were equally non-existent according to government records. But bonds forged in combat operations don't disappear with retirement paperwork, and certain skills are far too valuable to allow deterioration through disuse. "Martinez," a familiar voice answered on the second ring. "It's Torres," Frank said without preamble. "I need a significant favor." "Frank? Jesus Christ, it's been what, 6 years since Bosnia?" the voice replied with obvious surprise. "Thought you were completely done with this kind of work." Frank admitted that he'd thought so too, but some fights have a way of finding you whether you want them or not, regardless of your retirement status. There was a brief pause before Martinez asked what Frank needed. Frank requested a complete intelligence workup on a trafficking operation that was attempting to establish itself in Detroit. Professional-level organization, probable federal protection, operating with apparent impunity, he explained. They just made the tactical error of attempting to recruit assets in my immediate neighborhood. Martinez's laugh carried grim satisfaction. "Same old Frank," he observed. "Absolutely cannot resist getting involved when innocent people are being threatened by predators." Frank asked directly whether Martinez could provide assistance or not. "Can I help?" Martinez responded. "Frank, approximately half the personnel from our old unit currently work private security or federal task force assignments. The other half operate businesses exactly like yours. Quiet, low profile, perfect for surveillance and intelligence gathering operations. You're not requesting assistance from one retired Marine. You're activating an entire network of professionals. Frank smiled genuinely for the first time since the morning's confrontation as he asked how quickly Martinez could mobilize resources. Martinez replied that he could provide preliminary intelligence analysis within 6 hours, complete operational planning within 12 hours, and have assets positioned and ready for action within 18 hours maximum. Frank said to make it 12 hours total. These people operate on accelerated timelines and don't accommodate convenient scheduling preferences. 12 hours confirmed, Martinez agreed. Frank, it's genuinely good to have you back in operational status, even temporarily. As Frank ended the communication, he surveyed his garage with completely different eyes. Tomorrow morning, it would still function as Torres Auto Repair, where neighbors brought their vehicles for honest work at fair prices. But tonight, it would transform into something entirely different. The command center for an operation that would teach this trafficking network a lesson they would never have the opportunity to forget. Some old Marines never lose their tactical edge. And some battles are far too important to leave to chance or hope. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, Frank Torres would systematically dismantle an entire criminal empire, piece by piece, using nothing more than a neighborhood auto repair shop, 25 years of combat experience, and the kind of tactical genius that had made him a legend in places whose names would never appear in history books. What the trafficking organization didn't understand was that they hadn't just threatened a neighborhood. They had declared war on a master of asymmetric warfare who had spent decades perfecting the art of making the impossible look routine. And Frank Torres had never lost a war. We share incredible stories like this one every single day. If this story touched you, please hit that like button. It really helps us reach more people who need to hear these tales of courage and justice. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch, and we'll see you tomorrow with another unforgettable story.